Good morning everyone, thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be speaking about rusts in your wheat crops with Jeff Thomas from the South Perth office. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Dominic, and welcome along everybody that's online. Today we're going to be talking about wheat rusts, which is a pretty topical subject at the moment, and I think will continue to be topical throughout the rest of the season. What I plan to do is just generally go through some general points about rust diseases, and then follow up with a little bit of specific discussion on each of the rust diseases. So I guess the first point to note is that for the first time in a while we've been seeing leaf, stripe and stem rusts observed in both regrowth and crops this season. Why this year? Well, I guess a lot of the reports that we've seen have been related to the presence of an autumn green bridge, which has been continuing into the cropping season. So a lot of those regions which received fairly strong rain through the February-March period, and as a result had some pretty good levels of regrowth, have seen some of that regrowth perpetuating right through to the start of the cropping season and actually right into the cropping season. And that's a classic autumn green bridge for the carrying of and multiplying of rust diseases. We've also seen obviously some other green bridge diseases, wheat streak mosaic virus, and even the powdery mildew that we've seen, I think, has been contributed to from that green bridge. So that's why I think we're seeing that particular issue this season. So what do the rusts need to actually survive and grow? Well, they need moisture to infect. So about 4 to 6 hours of leaf wetness at an optimum temperature, and we're talking about rain or heavy dew or even a high humidity in a dense canopy are needed for the spores to germinate and penetrate. But importantly, they don't actually need rain or moisture to sporulate or to spread. And in fact, probably the favourable sort of conditions for rust to spread around is with sort of warmish, dry days which allow the breeze to spread the spores, and then a damp, humid, rainy or dewy evening when we get infection occurring. So that's pretty common throughout the three rusts. I guess the big difference between them is around the optimum temperatures that they prefer. So stripe rust has always been sort of considered that sort of cool weather disease. Optimum temperatures sort of 12 to 20 degrees, pretty much WA winter spring conditions. But what we know is that it reduces in intensity as temperatures rise up above that 20, sort of up around 23. In fact, the disease pretty much becomes dormant within the plant. Not that it dies, but that we get reduced sporulation, reduced growth, and therefore a slowing of the epidemic. Leaf rust I would consider to be probably, you want to call it the all-rounder of the team. It's pretty much has temperature optimum sort of from 15 to 25 degrees, which is pretty much all of our winter and spring. And so we can see leaf rust bubbling along at a low level in a lot of crops during the winter, and then as the spring starts to warm, that's when it really can take off and multiply, particularly in those susceptible varieties. I think stem rust is usually the sleeper in most seasons, and the one that probably gives me the most concern. It is a warm weather disease, sort of 20 to 35 degrees, and that's why we mostly see it later in the spring, sort of most common during grain fill. And certainly what we see is often it occurs after we've stopped looking at our crops, and so it can jump out and bite us without us realising. Briefly on management, what do we need to do to manage these things? Well, the number one thing is monitoring crops. We need to know to catch the epidemic early. We need to be able to get in and use fungicides prior to disease becoming particularly entrenched in the crop. So we need to use our fungicides as a protectant, not try to use them as a cure. So monitoring is the absolute number one priority. When there is rust present and we've got conditions that are favourable, we need, as I said, we need to use the fungicide before the disease reaches damaging levels. So in our sort of very susceptible, moderately susceptible varieties, we need to be spraying those before the disease reaches epidemic levels. I'll come on to the stem rust story about the economics of spraying at later stages, later on in the discussion. But the final thing I wanted to talk about in this summary was that what do we do for next year? Well, we know there's a lot of inoculum around this year, so what we need to be thinking about is actually doing a better job of managing the green bridge prior to the start of the season to try and limit that rust carryover from the green bridge into the cropping. And so what we're talking about there is spraying out green bridge not only in our cropping paddocks but in our pasture paddocks, so that we're not carrying over the disease, and getting that out 3 to 4 weeks before the start of the season so that we've got a break in the epidemic. And I wanted to add just one other point here, and that was to just think about at this point diversifying varieties, looking at the options that we might have to maybe spread our risk within our cropping system. And so I know that changing varieties wholesale is not that easy, but maybe it's time to start thinking about adding some diversity, capacity in the future to be able to diversify our varieties. So if we move along to stripe rust, and stripe rust is something we haven't seen in an epidemic proportion for several years, but obviously it's just been bubbling away in our susceptible varieties at a very low level, waiting for a perfect opportunity such as we've got this year. So we're seeing hotspots occurring in paddocks in the sort of northwest central and northern wheat belt. Most of the reports we know are coming from susceptible varieties such as Kalingerie, and so those susceptible varieties as a green bridge have obviously perpetuated the disease, and are now we're seeing the responses in crop. We have had one report of infection in a suspected maize crop. Samples have been sent to Sydney University, and we're waiting for confirmation through Sydney University, which brings me to an important point to make now, is that please, all samples of rust should be sent through to Sydney University for pathotyping. It allows us to stay ahead of the game in terms of understanding what the threats are in terms of rust. So, specifically on stripe rust management, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think generally speaking it's pretty well understood. But as I said, the temperatures that are favourable for stripe rust are in that sort of 12 to 20 degrees, and really what we're talking about is right now. So this is the optimum time for fairly rapid spread of stripe rust within our crops, and certainly as the weather warms in the north, the temperature will become less favourable, but certainly further south we can see that weather conditions will stay favourable for at least a month or more. So again, we should be monitoring. And the fungicide timing, as I said, is most important. Probably more so than the product that you're worried about is getting the fungicide on at an appropriate time. The only other point I'd probably like to make here is that trials that we've done have indicated that responses after flowering are probably less likely unless you're in that sort of longer season environment with a susceptible variety. Twofold. One is obviously sprays after flowering have less time to be active, and certainly we know with stripe rust that the conditions begin to warm up after flowering, and so the conditions become less favourable for the disease. Leaf rust. Leaf rust is probably the disease we see most commonly from season to season, and this year there's certainly been reports of leaf rust in maize crops from most regions. I've had calls from above Geraldton to Esperance from about maize crops carrying a level of leaf rust. And we know that in 2013 we had an incursion of a new leaf rust pathotype. I'll just call it LR76 rather than going through all those numbers. And the samples that have been sent to Sydney University this year have been confirmed as this LR76 pathotype this season. And certainly the trials that were carried out and the screening that was carried out last season with the LR76 pathotype indicated that maize is moderately susceptible to this pathotype. And so that means that we certainly need to be monitoring our maize crops for the presence of leaf rust. Leaf rust is the great all-rounder. It has optimum temperatures in that sort of 15 to 25 degree range. And that means that the time for leaf rust is through most of the season, but a really important time in terms of as the temperatures warm slightly means that right now and over the next month are really favourable for the development and explosion of leaf rust in crops. And certainly within our susceptible varieties like a stiletto, we can see that those crops that are infected, we can see a pretty rapid takeoff of that disease. So monitoring, it remains a really important point with your wheat for leaf rust. And again, getting the fungicide on before the disease takes off is probably more important than trying to fuss about which product that it is that you're using. Just in terms of mace and the LR76 pathotype, trials last year showed that when the disease was present in the crop from around stem extension and disease pressure was pretty high, there were significant yield losses of more than 20% yield loss in a trial at the Carnarvon Research Station, very optimum conditions for the disease, but certainly yield losses were occurred. When the disease was introduced after flag leaf, then what we saw was that the disease really didn't establish anywhere near as well, and yield losses were far more minimal. Final topic I'd like to touch off on is obviously stem rust, and stem rust is a bit of a sleeper, I think, in terms of the fact that often it's building up in crops without us realising. We've had reports of stem rust on regrowth from a month or so ago in Pestvacs, both from northern, central and down around the lakes region, and certainly in the last couple of weeks in crops up in the north and around Agena, and just this week from eastern wheatbelt crops. So certainly stem rust is present in susceptible varieties such as Calingary and Arano already. As I said, stem rust is favoured by hot days and mild nights, so sort of 25 to 35 degrees days and mild nights of 15 to 20 degrees. Still needs about 6 to 8 hours of leaf wetness, so we're talking about a nighttime dew development. With all of these rusts, stem rust has a latent period, that is infection to sporulation, of about 7 to 10 days. Leaf rust is about the same, about 7 to 10 days. So we're seeing a turnaround under optimum conditions of around a week in terms of a life cycle. Stripe rust is slightly longer, of around sort of 10 to 14 days, but certainly with leaf and stem rust, as the temperature's warm, just over a week sees a complete life cycle. The thing about stem rust is it can develop later in the crop growth, after head emergence, due to the preference of the fungus for those warm temperatures. So therefore, spraying for stem rust can be economic at much later growth stages than other diseases, than the other rusts. But a pointer here is that even though you can spray the crop late at those later growth stages, if you've let the rust get away from you and it's really toweling into the top of the plant, then sometimes you're not going to see any benefit from applying a fungicide in that situation. So we're saying that we should be spraying those susceptible varieties when disease is apparent, and that delaying can result in yield and grain quality losses. It's a difficult disease to control. Trials have shown that high label rates are preferable. Good coverage and penetration are particularly important in terms of getting to where the rust is. If we're going an early spray, then a second spray could be needed and certainly can be beneficial. And just a pointer here, that there have been several trials that have indicated that whilst propiconazole is effective in terms of reducing disease, it's probably not as effective as some of the other products that you might be able to utilise that are registered for that use. As a simple table to give some guidance, basically, if we're before ear emergence, so sort of flag leaf through to the heads coming out, and you've got a moderately susceptible, very susceptible, up to moderately susceptible variety, and you basically, if you're finding stem rust in the crop at sort of 1 to 5% or trace levels, by the time you get out and sort out the fungicide and get out there, it's certainly time to be spraying that crop. You've got a bit more think time with those MRMS to MR type varieties where you monitor them, and if the disease continues to develop in those crops before head emergence up to more than 5%, then you should be thinking about spraying. As time goes on, after ear emergence through to sort of early dough stage, again, if you're finding stem rust at that sort of 5% level, then you should be spraying your susceptible varieties. You've probably got a little bit more leeway with the more resistant varieties. Again, if it's building up, then consider spraying. Very briefly, I'm just going to touch off on a couple of trials. I think this is really important because I've been having questions about when should I spray for stem rust. So I've got two trials here. One is a trial conducted by Rob Lockman on Westonia wheat, where stem rust was detected at booting, so prior to the head emerging, only at trace levels. Folicur was applied, so tebuconazole was applied at a low and a high rate, and then coming back 3 weeks later and applying at post-flowering, just at post-flowering, when rust had developed up on the flag sheath. And if we very briefly look at the results, we can see in terms of yield, both the early spray and the later spray return significant yield responses, fairly similar levels. Interestingly, that the dual spray gave a significant increase over either of those. If we go to the top of the page and look at why that might be, we can see that the early spray before the head came out had very good control of rust on the leaf sheath, but poorer control on the peduncle and head, but poorer control on the peduncle and head because they weren't emerged at the time of spraying. Whereas the later spray had allowed disease to develop on the leaf sheath, but managed to protect the peduncle and head because they were out at the time of spraying. Hence we had this significant response, but where we predicted both parts of the plant, we certainly had a combined response. Similarly, in a trial conducted by Keith Jayasena down at Gibson in 2011, I'm not going to spend as much time on this one. Basically, we can see that an early spray at booting, that's time 1, provided us with around a 30% yield response. A time 2 spray at post-flowering or at flowering provided us with about a 40% yield response, but in fact a combined spray had over 50%. Whilst I'm not suggesting that we need to be definitely spraying twice on these crops, what this is telling us is that in a susceptible variety, a significant amount of damage is occurring even if the rust is detected at flag leaf before the head is out, and there is a benefit to be had from applying fungicide at that time and then reassessing when 2 or 3 weeks later to see if the rust is progressing within the canopy. And again, I'll just make that point, this is one of those trials that just indicates a small difference between propiconazole and other products. Finally, I'd just like to point out that there are a number of people within the Department of Agriculture associated with cereal disease work, and most importantly, that we need to be sending as many samples as we can to Australian Cereal Rust Survey for rust pathotyping. This is actually a replied paid service, and so if you utilise this address here, you won't actually have to be forking out any cash to be doing that. There are a number of useful resources, and these are available both here through the Department of Agriculture or through the Rust Bust website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.